Hello, welcome. I'm Ann Stillwater. Please call me Ann, although my current students call me Nurse Stillwater. I have been a second victim, and unless you are a candidate for sainthood, you probably have been too. In 2018, I introduced school nurses to the concept of second victim. It would be nice if we could be in person. If we were, I would not have a script, but it's harder for me to speak to a camera than to people. The plus side is that now there's a video for you to look at again and eventually for others to see. If you don't have a pen and paper or another way to write, please pause and go get that now. Also, pause as needed if you want more time in one section or if you need some time for yourself, because this topic can raise uncomfortable feelings for a lot of us. First, let's get this definition on the table for those of you who have not heard of second victims before. The Center for Patient Safety in Missouri defines it like this. Second victims are healthcare providers who are involved in an unanticipated adverse patient event, medical error, and/or a patient-related injury, and become victimized in the sense that the provider is traumatized by the event. End quote. We will go into greater detail later on, but these can be heavy issues, so I want to start with some brighter moments and a bit of broader perspective. Please make some notes about some of the lighter, more memorable moments in your nursing career while I tell you about two that I remember. The first is a student who told me they cannot tell time on an analog clock. You know, like this, with the clock face and hands that go around in circles. When I tried to teach it to them, they dismissed me and said, "Well, I missed that day in school when they taught that unit back in whatever grade." I still roll my eyes, smile, and sigh at the mindset that this kid felt they could not learn it because they had missed that unit at school. A more fun interaction was the student who got their hoodie string caught in their braces. We laughed and laughed as I figured out that there was a small space at the back of the bracket where I could carefully extricate the string. I started school nursing as a public health nurse in Ohio. Back when we moved to the area, none of us ordinary folks ever dreamed we would have mobile phones. And we told the kids we had no television reception, although if we put the tiny TV in the far corner and had the antennae just right, one or maybe two stations came in. I still have no cell service there. About half my job as a public health nurse in this rural area was going to the 14 schools in the county that did not have their own school nurse. At the time, there was no requirement for a district to have a school nurse, although sometime around the turn of this century, they got one. In those 14 schools, I did the bare minimum of checking immunizations, did the every other year mandated screenings, and was available for consultations on things like lice and other contagious diseases. Most of the other half of my job was doing case management for families with children with disabilities, and I did a bit of reportable disease follow-up, which has come in very handy during this COVID pandemic, and also helping out in the immunization clinic. One of the mistakes I made early on involved giving immunizations to a baby. It was my first few weeks of giving immunizations on my own. I was so proud of myself as I carefully figured out what was needed, got all the vaccinations ready, and gave them to the 1-month-old. And then my fellow nurse pointed out that this baby was only supposed to get one hepatitis B vaccine. I had given them the vaccinations that should be given at 2 months. My heart sank. I immediately began to scold myself as the other nurse got our medical director, who researched the situation and very kindly reassured me that it was not going to harm the baby. Jump ahead 3 decades into this century. Over the last few years, as I've been entering immunizations into the computerized health records, I've been reminded of that mistake. Frequently, when I'm entering new immunizations, I'll start scolding myself again. feeling shame, reliving it, re-traumatization over and over again. This is the core of the second victim experience, trauma related to making a mistake. Have you experienced something like this? Trauma. A therapist I know says that the quick definition of trauma is too much, too fast, too soon. And hasn't that happened to pretty much all of us? Sometimes daily, sometimes hourly. I hope everyone here has heard about trauma-informed care in the ACEs study. Adverse childhood experiences, studied by Kaiser and many others over the last few decades, have been shown to increase health issues and substantially decrease life expectancy. And we are all urged to consider these as we interact with our students and their parents. Also, our coworkers might have lots of adverse childhood experiences. In the middle of 2020, as the COVID pandemic continued and we were all home for months instead of weeks, I heard several mental health experts explaining that all of us were and are traumatized by the actual and potential getting sick, giving it to someone else, the loss of life, as well as the loss of our hopes, dreams, and plans, including travel plans. And this is not just students, it's us, nurses, the rest of the school staff, and the rest of the world. More recently, I've been learning about intergenerational trauma from Resmaa Menakem. It may be cultural, passed on through the family's hidden rules and socio-emotional style, or epigenetic, passed on physically through gene expressions that are turned on or off based on ancestral experiences, or some combination of the two. Scientists are still working on figuring this out, but if we look back at our ancestors' experiences, there's almost certain to be trauma, for centuries or millennia, probably on another continent. Even if our own adverse childhood experiences are minimal or none, we probably all will benefit from reviewing trauma a bit before diving into the second victim concept. All of us have probably also studied the fight or flight response, stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Its complement is the parasympathetic nervous system. These are old evolutionary patterns that helped us survive. The hypothalamus, centered in the so-called limbic part of the brain, sends out neurohormones that activate the nervous system. The area is the home of much of our emotional, unconscious reactions. When our emotions are traumatized, when our limbic system perceives a threat, the acute stress response here is activated, and we can only fight, flee, freeze, or put on a facade. We can't access our thinking brain, the cerebral cortex, that white part around the outside of the limbic brain, when we feel that traumatic threat. When that threat is not a physical threat to our very existence, like a predator about to get us, we will hopefully realize that and want to get out of the panicked mode so we have full access to our full brain. That was a lot of words. Dr. Allison Jackson explains it much better than I did and has given us a great tool that I use with my students, which you might also want to share with your students. This will jump into the video rather quickly.
So I want to talk for a minute about how to teach the brain. One of the really important things that we know in trauma is that when we help people understand the injury trauma creates in the brain and help them understand how that impacts the way they respond to other events in the world, it really helps them and their families move forward in their healing. So lots of people have given ways to teach the brain. As a practitioner myself, I've taken a lot of the models from Dr. Dan Siegel, taken models from the Hahn Foundation for teaching in the optimistic classroom and looking at some of the things Ledoux has done and put them together and really challenged myself and folks that I educate about practicing really teaching the brain. So when I explain this to teenagers, I start with the hand model, okay? And I start by explaining that we're going to talk about the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain that everyone has. Formally, this is called the limbic system, and this is called the cerebral cortex. But what we're going to talk is downstairs brain and upstairs brain. So in your downstairs brain, this is where fight, flight, or freeze lives, okay? When threat comes at you, your body has 3 reactions it can make. It can fight, it can run away, or it can stay very still until the danger's gone. That's what this brain does, okay? This part of the brain. What's up here, the upstairs brain, its job, among many other things, is to solve problems, to help you calm down, solve problems, okay? And to tell the downstairs brain, I got this. We're gonna be okay. There's another solution. So what happens a lot of times to kids who've experienced trauma is if you think about these like muscles, because you've gone through a lot of threat, this downstairs part of the brain's been doing push-ups your whole life, okay? So this part of the brain's really strong. The part of your brain that solves problems hasn't had as much exercise because you've had to be really strong to be a survivor, a thriver. So what happens is that the brain gets what I call emotionally hijacked. This downstairs brain comes up on top of this brain, it takes over, okay? So the downstairs brain's in control. And so you fight, you run, you freeze. The only things that work when you're down here are things that calm you down. So we call them self-regulation skills. And that happens from connection. Somebody talking to you, helping you breathe, helping you feel your body calm down. Once that happens, then the upstairs brain can come back, and then you can solve problems. So that's how I try to explain to teenagers the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain, and what happens to them when they experience a threat. With young children, what I've found is they like animals. When I say young, probably 3 to 8 years old. Sometimes teenagers like it too. And so what we call this is the downstairs brain, that threat center again, is what I call the barking dog. If you think about when any noise or threat makes, usually a dog will bark. So this is the barking dog, okay? A problem solver is often called the wise owl. So upstairs is the wise owl, downstairs is the barking dog, okay? When the dog barks, the owl flies away. And so when the dog's barking, the only things they can do are maybe practice blowing bubbles, maybe practice breathing deeply, things that help the dog start calming down. And that's where you build their self-care strategies. They practice lots of different things to help the dog stop barking. The first skill being recognizing when their dog barks. Once they learn how to calm the barking dog, then the owl flies back, and then they can come up with solutions. And again, they're trying to get this muscle stronger. The problem for most people who are intervening, if you're talking to a family, most parents are going to naturally start with redirection and consequences for negative behavior. That's the first place they go. They're shaking fingers and telling somebody, stop that, you need to do this. That's an upstairs brain intervention, while most children who've experienced trauma are downstairs. So the term Siegel uses is you connect, then you redirect. The only thing that will calm a barking dog or the downstairs brain is helping that child calm down. And only then, once you teach the child to calm down, can you engage the part of the brain that solves problems and actually come up with solutions for better behavior choices. And that's why it's important to respond to the need, respond to the safety needs that get kicked up by threat, and not just react to the behavior that happens.
The way out of this traumatic fight or flight response, the way to soothe the barking dog, is to invite the wise owl back. The wise owl won't return until I realize I am safe, that I can orient myself in the here and now, feeling that safety, to settle my feelings and my body. Resmaa Menakem explains it masterfully with lots of practices. I highly recommend his book, My Grandmother's Hands, which is listed in the references. Settling. The parasympathetic nervous system is complementary to the sympathetic nervous system with its well-known fight or flight. It was much later in my career that I heard the opposite of fight or flight, which is the feed and breed and rest and digest of the parasympathetic nervous system. Settling activates the parasympathetic nervous system. When I relax, I can open up access to my cerebral cortex, my thinking brain, and the wide variety of logical and creative thoughts that are likely to be less reactive and more productive. We are moving into a short guided meditation now, so make yourself comfortable. We will be using our sense of vision, so keep your eyes open. I could do this same exercise with another sense, such as hearing, but this time it's vision. To settle myself, I breathe deeply. I make myself comfortable. I am aware of the support beneath me. Safety is key to being able to relax, so I begin by looking around me. I look behind me and in all directions. I orient myself and calm myself in this time and place using my sense of vision. I allow my gaze to gently rest on an item in the room. I pause and breathe deeply as I consider this one item. This one item. Its size, shape, color, any texture or smoothness. How my gaze on this item means that other items in front of or behind it might not be in such sharp focus. And then I move on to another item. Again, looking at it with openness and considering the richness of this item with so many aspects to it. This moment, looking, not staring, just a calm and quiet look-see before I move on to another item. I am bringing my focus into this moment and this place. Breathing, noticing, aware. Breathing, noticing, aware. And now I bring my awareness back to the whole room, to the screen, hopefully feeling more oriented and safer, ready to bring this settled awareness with me as we come back to the world of nursing. The editor of the Journal of School Nursing, Dr. Martha Dewey Bergren, encourages us to incorporate trauma-informed care into the entire school community. I want to urge us to incorporate trauma-informed care into our self-care. We all deserve it. Meds are an important part of nursing. Back in 1914, before the last pandemic, nursing students were exhorted to have a singular focus on medication preparation. How many of us have the luxury of being able to shut out all distractions while giving meds? Maybe a lucky few of us. We are human and will make mistakes. Our work situations were already busy and complicated with increasingly complex technology, and now most or all of us have added COVID to our workload. This is one of the very few times in the presentation when I am going to read the words on the screen because Trieber and Jones say it so well. Nurses learn that safe medication administration is an individual responsibility and that the blame for errors ultimately rests with the person administering the drugs. Accurate administration of medications is such a deeply embedded principle of nursing that making these errors threatens the professional self, jeopardizing both identity and livelihood. It also means potentially harming another human being, thus violating the medical ethic to do no harm. And yet, we continue to care for our patients. When I have made a med error, it hits my self-esteem and sends my brain into traumatic fight or flight mode. And even when I have made an error, I'm still on the job. There are still students, teachers, phone calls, emails demanding my attention, and maybe some more meds to give. One of the nurses who has talked to me over the years was told this. How's that for traumatizing? For decades, I tried to be perfect, and I just drove myself and everyone around me crazy. There are 3 large studies that included school medication errors, and one of them is limited to one state, Iowa. This is me with Dr. Aaron Maughan, the NASN Director of Research on the left, and Dr. Anne-Marie McCarthy, the University of Iowa, on the right. They ran a workshop on medication administration guidelines at the NASN conference in Baltimore. They were tickled that I wanted to have my picture taken with them, the authors of the studies that I had been using in my research. And these are 2 of the 3 lead researchers in the studies that I'm about to share more fully with you. Warning, this next slide has a lot of information. This is one spot where you might want to hit pause. Notice that in 2 of the studies, about half of respondents admitted to a mistake. But in Maughan's study, it was only about 16%. The researchers believe that 16% error rate is artificially low and hypothesize that an increased awareness of the seriousness of medication errors led to underreporting. And by the way, school nurses with more education were more likely to report an error. Ferris did not provide a clean statistic of X% had medication errors, like the other 2, but instead listed the error types and the number of schools that had the errors, which is why this is an estimate. This study, Ferris's, surveyed the principals, although some of the respondents were school nurses, and there were often non-nurses giving the meds. Look at how these 3 studies asked about different types of med errors. Ferris includes an error of medication not supplied to the school, but the other 2 don't. Ferris also differentiates between the student being called to come for their medicine but not showing up, and the nurse or whoever forgetting to call them down. Think about some of your own medication errors. I included a lot of categories here because it was helpful for me to see that others had made the same mistake. I was not alone. Given the importance of proper medication administration, it seems a bit odd that there are not more studies. Having done some research on this, I have a few thoughts. Many school nurses are supervised by educators who lack formal medical training. We might be asked to exceed our scope of practice. There might be pressure to go along with what the parent wants instead of the provider's order or best nursing practice. Has this happened to you? We don't have standardized medication error definitions or reporting systems. If I had to write up every dose missed because the parents did not supply the medicine, that would be a lot of paperwork. And each school, district, state, and country has different standards. Even NASN's medication administration toolkit is different than Pennsylvania's standards. When we do admit a mistake, will we get slammed? And Maughan found out through her study that nurses don't want to admit mistakes. We've been taught to be embarrassed by mistakes and expect perfection from ourselves. I have made a few mistakes in my nursing career, like that immunization one. There were actually 2 events that led to my research, which was published. The second one was maybe not a med error, but I didn't follow best practice. That's part of why some researchers talk about adverse events instead of mistakes. This story is why I started searching and eventually found out about the second victim concept and that I was one. This happened after my previous medication error, which is included in the study. I am short, and my coworker was even shorter. We were in a very busy clinic, day in, day out. There came a day when both of us happened to be off and 2 substitute nurses were there. Taller substitute nurses. One of them found a pill in a medicine cup on the top shelf of the locked medicine cabinet. Instead of calling me and my coworker, they called administration, who interviewed me and my coworker separately. I knew right away that it was a dropped pill from a while ago, but could not remember the details of how it ended up there, except that I had put it there. It took some time for me to piece together what led to that pill being in that cup on that shelf. In the meantime, I was interrogated several times and was sternly told not to talk to anyone about it. As I racked my brain trying to remember what happened, I guessed that maybe I found it in the sink, and I told them that. By the time I remembered what really happened, the union rep told me not to change my story. I found it on the floor after a parent had brought meds in. It had been a very busy day as usual, but I emailed the parent, who I thought dropped it, and I put it safely on that shelf just out of my view. I hadn't been comfortable with the parent's emailed request to add it back to the bottle, and then forgot about it. After the firestorm, I talked to the parent about it, and they were fine with the pill having been destroyed by the substitute nurse, and thought maybe that was the better response after all. When I found it, I should have taken the time to count the pills in the bottle to see if it was from our stock or from the parents. But I didn't, and ended up in this mess. And the union rep telling me not to tell the truth was very difficult for me. And here I am, having published about med errors, and still feeling uncomfortable about this first time telling the full story to so many. The second medication issue is what led to my research on school nurse medication errors. There were so few studies on them that I decided to do my own research and get stories from other nurses. Several people said that they would supply stories and did not. I later came to understand that it was just too traumatic, or perhaps they were worried about confidentiality, or some combination of the two. About as many people backed out as ended up sharing their stories. What I did get from my post on School Nurse Net were suggestions to get IRB approval. More suggestions to go through an IRB than nurses willing to share stories. At the time, I thought that since nurses were sharing their own story, there was no need to have an IRB for confidentiality reasons. I was not doing the research through an institution of higher education, so I didn't have access to an IRB. I'll come back to this point later. For now, on with the stories. In this first story, the health assistant who usually did the multiple diabetic checks was not there. The nurse had a student check for ketones when their blood glucose was 250. Only after the angry parent called the supervisor did the nurse reread the order and see that they missed an important word, if. The student did not have nausea or vomiting. The supervisor criticized the nurse and told the parent that the nurse had not followed doctor's orders and would be reprimanded, and this brought up at an annual evaluation. The nurse had to write it up as a med error for review, and it was brought up at the annual evaluation as an example that the nurse did not follow nursing procedures. Remember back a bit when I talked about the punitive error reporting system? On to the second story. The nurse was distracted by an out-of-school event. They grabbed the wrong bottle and did not realize it until the next student came in. Luckily, the student was fine. The parent did have them checked out in the ER, but was gracious and understanding. This may have been the first reported medication error under a new administrator and led to new systems and some additional safeguards, including the meds kept in an envelope with the student photo and birth date on the envelope. And in the last story, 6 fourth graders wanted inhalers after recess. One of them was still short of breath after they used their inhaler, and the parent happened to call from the doctor's office right then. So the nurse got an order for 2 more puffs, and the parent agreed to come and pick up the student and take him to the doctor. When the parent arrived, they discovered it was the wrong parent and the wrong doctor's office. 2 students had the same first and last names. The parent who came was very understanding, since this mix-up had happened before. The nurse called to cancel the order with the first doctor and got an order from the proper doctor and the proper parent. This supervisor reacted calmly, and it probably helped that the parents were understanding. I encourage all of us to write "verify the student" when names are the same or similar. Hopefully your electronic health record has a place to do this. Take a moment to write about some of the medication errors that you may have made or heard about. I am going to read another quote from Trieber and Jones. One of the most common themes we found was the level of devastating emotion associated with making a medication error. It is understandable that one would feel sick when making a serious error. However, we found that nurses' minor errors similarly resulted in raw, painful emotions. We identified strong emotional reactions in accounts of errors made recently as well as those made years, sometimes decades before. Nurses described a visceral response at the moment of realization that a medication error had been made. These responses were what they recalled in conjunction with the act, no matter how minor the error and no matter how long ago. I hit the library and searched for more information about these emotional reactions to mistakes made by nurses. Eventually, the search term perfectionism led me to an article on second victim. Mistakes are inevitable. Mistakes are inevitable. Notice that this was back in 1991, written for residents, doctors in name, but still in training. Back then, Wu wanted supervising physicians to respond sensitively, to maximize learning and support the clinician. There are some residents who left medicine after making mistakes. How many of you have heard of second victim before today? How many of you learned about it in school? If we were live, this is where I would ask you to raise your hand if you learned about the second victim concept in nursing school. Now, these differences, are they due to the fact that one's an ADN student and the others are in bachelor's programs? Or was it just the timing, that the second victim concept was not as well known in 2013? This would be a relatively easy research project for anyone who needs one. Second victim. The first victim is the student. I'm a school nurse because I love my students and do not want to harm them. The second victim is the healthcare provider who makes a mistake and is a victim due to the emotional trauma of harming or perhaps harming a patient and the fear of possible legal and administrative consequences. And the third victim is the institution. The school wants us to help them shine, and having to deal with issues and complaining parents might tarnish their reputation. Luckily, some hospitals have been studying this for a while. Dr. Sue Scott, who is super nice, and others have studied second victims' experiences and described 6 specific stages that all second victims seem to experience. I'll go through them in some detail. Stage 1 is chaos and accident response. Here there can be external and internal turmoil. When the nurse realized they gave the inhaler to the wrong student or the wrong med to the student, there are things that need to be done, even as the nurse is silently shrieking inside. This is the moment that is very likely to take the nurse out of calmness and into that downstairs brain. Intrusive reflection is stage 2. This is where I could not sleep at night and kept obsessively thinking about that pill in the cup, as if worrying about it was going to magically restore my memory. I was stuck in that traumatic stress response, with my adrenaline pumping out at warp speed as my limbic brain dog kept barking. Restoring personal integrity, stage 3, can include a lot of individualized responses, but generally this is calling to talk to that one trusted school nurse friend. Hopefully they will say, "That's not a mistake," or "You're a good nurse, remember when you," and tell me something that I've done well in the past. Returning to work is probably a bigger deal for hospital nurses, but even as school nurses will have coworkers and administrators who know what happened, as well as students, families, and teachers. It takes courage and what Dr. Jackson calls self-regulation skills to walk back into that environment. One additional complication here is privacy and legal issues. I can't tell my spouse or non-medical friend details because of confidentiality. Plus, they just won't get it. These are the first attempts at getting the wise owl to come back. Impact realization. These first 3 stages, chaos and accident response, intrusive reflection, and restoring personal integrity, can occur simultaneously, or the second victim may jump between them. That is why there's that circular arrow between these first 3 stages. It can feel like a metaphoric tornado. Please take a moment to jot down a few notes about your experiences with these first 3 stages, related to what you wrote down earlier. Did you feel trauma? What were your experiences? Pause if you need to. Let's move on to the next stages. And stage 4 is enduring the inquisition. Professional doubt deepens as the administrators investigate. Will I lose my job? Will I be sued? Is my malpractice insurance paid up? I might lose my license and not be able to work as a nurse anymore. And I want to reassure all of us. A nurse who was on a state board of nursing committee that dealt with complaints told me that they are nurses and all very understanding that mistakes happen. Emotional first aid. This is a deeper dive into restoring personal integrity. Again, confidentiality might limit sharing. Even if our employer has an employee assistance program, or we can find a professional counselor, they may have a hard time understanding the situation. Oh, FYI, your employee assistance program probably won't have a call-in hotline for immediate counseling, but rather a list of counselors for you to contact. Some healthcare institutions offer employee wellness staff or a chaplain or a specific second victim program, a support system, but I don't know of any schools that do. Often we have to muddle out of our fight or flight response without institutional support. Stage 6, the last stage, moving on, has 3 possible outcomes. Dropping out means leaving the employer or the profession, or perhaps the employer pressures the healthcare provider to drop out. Survive. Remaining there, but dealing with the continual reenactments of the mistake or adverse event. Every time I walk over there or see that student or teacher, I remember that mistake. Or every time I enter a new student's immunization information, I remember that mistake and put myself back into the uncomfortable adrenaline rush of my limbic brain. I have heard folks say that I have to feel to heal. When I try to push the feelings down, they often squeeze out sideways in uncomfortable and embarrassing ways. Looking more deeply at the error, learning more about why it happened and how to prevent similar future mistakes may lead to some good. I might be able to help others in a similar situation. Remen is a physician who worked with cancer patients for years. I love that she was writing her book at the same time that Albert Wu was coining the term second victim. Instead of trying to hide from the trauma, do I have the courage to look at it and incorporate it so I can move on as a wiser person? This does not mean I'm not traumatized. It means I am managing my trauma, using it as a springboard for growth. Take a moment to write down the outcomes from your situations. Feel free to pause or keep writing as I go on to the next slide. These stages show some structure in the difficult and crazy journey after an adverse event like a med error. Knowing that others have had similar feelings provided instant relief when I read about second victims for the first time. I was not alone, and my seemingly crazy reactions were normal. These stages are a bit like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Some folks have thought of the stages of grief as a linear map, like what's shown here. This is despite what she herself wrote about it being a convoluted journey through grief, where you jump around through the stages. Second victims may not take a straight path through the trajectory stages. That's me. Feeling stuck in the survival stage led me to circle back, which led me to this research, which led me to discovering the second victim concept and the stages. I had no idea where it would lead me, but I knew I wanted to do something to get myself out of the craziness I was feeling. But not all second victim experiences involve an actual mistake. 1/3 of healthcare providers who have a near miss are haunted by it. One of the nurses I have talked to over the years told me of a time they did not give the wrong medication to a student, but almost did. The kid reported it to the parent, who complained to the administrator and hounded them until the nurse was forced out of their job. Or perhaps you can think of a time when administration decided to do something that led to emotional distress for the nurse, either because the administrator's decision hurt the student, even if the nurse wasn't involved, or maybe there were policies that impacted the nurse more directly, or constantly hounding the nurse for some information that just wasn't available in that moment. When I first started learning about second victims, I quickly realized that teachers can also be second victims. Think of a time a teacher was upset because they said the wrong thing, and either a parent or a student was hurt or got mad. And administrators can be second victims too. And then I was talking to my non-medical, non-education friend about second victims. Several years after I first explained it to them, they said that it had been so helpful. We are all trying to do our best, and so many people beat themselves up when they make a mistake and things don't go right, or someone's feelings get hurt. More to think about. The Center for Patient Safety at the University of Missouri came up with a list of certain situations that are more likely to result in a second victim experience for hospital workers. What would these be for school nurses? Some nurses watching this almost certainly have dealt with a death at the school or in the school community. Preventable harm is something I think created the majority of my second victim experiences. And what if something goes wrong with a student who we are close to, or reminds us of our own kids? When there is a parent who has hired a lawyer, there is suddenly much more stress around anything having to do with that student. I can easily see that leading to a second victim experience. Hint, another area of possible study, if anyone is looking for research topics, could look at what school nurses' high-risk scenarios would be. Some might say I am thriving now. Sometimes I go back into survival mode and beat myself up again for not having been perfect. But it's so helpful to know that I was not and am not alone. All healthcare providers who make a mistake or go through an adverse event experience similar feelings and stages. How do we heal? At first, I thought of the second victim concept as a path out, but it is not. Like grief, these traumatic experiences are always with me, always with the second victim, but support and some tools can help. All healthcare settings should be offering second victim support, but we are school nurses and in that gray area between healthcare and education. We're often the only ones in the school who know what the law and best practices are, and there's usually not the time or the money to implement best practices. In 2021, Dr. Martha Dewey Berggren and NASN created the School Nursing Evidence-Based Clinical Practice Guidelines for Medication Administration in Schools. If we take these guidelines to our administrators, will they be willing to create a non-punitive culture and a reporting system? How do we provide second victim support for the school nurse who has a med error, a near miss, or another adverse event? 3 hospitals have pioneered second victim support. Since I only live about an hour from Baltimore, I went and met with Dr. Albert Wu and his colleague, nurse researcher Cheryl Connors. Their RISE program, RISE, Resiliency in Stressful Events, trains enough staff members so there's always someone on duty for all shifts. Nothing is written down to avoid any possible legal ramifications. Johns Hopkins trains other organizations as well. When I last checked with them, they had trained hospitals and EMS providers, but no schools. The Center for Patient Safety in Missouri also does trainings for healthcare organizations. Dr. Sue Scott, who came up with the second victim trajectory, is their patient safety consultant. And their second victim support team, called For You, added pandemic-specific interventions to help during COVID. When I have talked about the second victim concept, some folks will say, "Oh, that's like vicarious trauma," or some other term. I have not spent much time on it, but I believe that each of these has its own body of literature, and to me, each seems like a different flavor of trauma. Moral injury has traditionally been used to describe soldiers who are traumatized by the harm they do while fighting. Now hospital nurses are feeling this as they scramble to take care of too many patients with not enough staff or resources, such as ventilators. And just this week, I heard a radio news article mention moral injury for the nurses. Other healthcare groups and professional organizations are talking about second victims. This and the next slide are from the AANA, the American Association of Nurse Anesthesiology. Anyone can go online and print out this card with excellent information about the second victim experience. I created a website where anyone can go and read the 2-page paper about school nurse second victims that was published in the journal NASN School Nurse in 2018. In the second half of 2022, this presentation should be available on the website if you want to share it with anyone. Maybe NASN or the National Education Association or some other group could send a school nurse through a second victim support training and set up a school nurse-specific support system. In the meantime, each state has their own state nursing association affiliate. Perhaps these NASN state affiliates could be the contact people for second victims in each state. It would be a start to some kind of second victim support for us. What do you think of these ideas? Do you have any others? Email me. Also, if you're looking for a research project for your education, consider studying school nurse second victims. I am happy to help. Remember back to how several nurses on School Nurse Net thought I should get IRB approval? Well, they were right. I had no idea how traumatic it would be for nurses to share their stories of med errors. That's part of why I have not done more research and keep suggesting that other school nurses who are back in school for advanced degrees work with me on a research project. I'm convinced we need IRB approval, and very few institutional review boards are willing to work with someone not associated with their institution. We have looked at some stuff that can be emotionally tough for a lot of us. The downstairs brain or barking dog may have appeared again. Few of us want to think about making mistakes, possible discipline, or losing our license. Some of us have a hard time admitting that no, really, I am not perfect and will make mistakes. Remember that story I told about giving the babies immunizations a month too early? Well, as I was preparing this presentation, I was entering some immunizations and suddenly it hit me. That was a second victim experience. Instead of letting it haunt me, I could send some love back to that younger me and remind myself that we all make mistakes and I am still a good nurse and a good person. And just a few days after opening my heart with compassion for my younger self, I suddenly noticed that the immunizations I was entering, the first DTP and polio vaccinations, were given at 1 month. Now, maybe there was a medical reason for this, but perhaps it was another nurse making the same mistake I did. I felt much less alone, felt a chill go through me, and sent that provider some caring and love. There are so many ways I can settle myself when the uncomfortable feelings come up. Spending time outside and guided meditations are some of my favorites. For other folks, it's prayer and meditation or intense exercise as part of their self-care. Find what works for you. This is from the artwork of one of my students, J.J. Thomas. When I saw it in late January, I had a second victim revelation. Sometimes I feel as if my peace or sanity is stolen from me, making me a victim. In these moments, it's easy to lash out in blame and anger. The old me felt safer in anger, rather than hurt, fear, or brokenness. Anger gives me something to do and makes my feelings someone else's fault. As I accept that my heart has been broken rather than stolen, I go through pain, but my heart softens and opens, and life becomes more peaceful. One thing that has helped me turn away from blame and anger is keeping a gratitude journal. Studies have shown that keeping a gratitude journal improves sleep and decreases stress. I found that writing down 5 things that I'm grateful for in a notebook at the end of each day has helped me sleep better. And studies say you really only need to write down 3. For me, this is another tool for self-care and recovery from the second victim trauma, and a tool for better sleep. Now let's do another, somewhat different, slightly longer, settling guided meditation. Please make yourself comfortable. Feel free to close your eyes if that feels safe and works well for you. This video of very slow-moving winter in Pennsylvania clouds will remain on the screen so you won't miss anything. I'll tell you when to open your eyes again. And you may notice a somewhat different sound quality since I have moved to the back of my home to hopefully decrease the traffic sounds during this meditation. You may also have noticed that I have been sighing a lot throughout the presentation. Remembering and talking about these stories is emotionally tough for me and might be for you too. Let's settle. I relax my body. I breathe deeply, feeling the air moving in and out, in and out. I might notice the cooler air on the edges of my nostrils and back of my throat as I breathe in, and warmer as I breathe out. I become aware of my body, soften my brain. I allow my curiosity to awaken and I release judgment. However I am feeling right now is okay. I briefly scan my body and notice areas that are tight. If I find any areas that feel more constricted or uncomfortable, I breathe and accept them. This is just noticing. I don't want or need to do anything differently. Just accept where I am right now. Scanning my body, I pay attention to my head and neck, shoulders, arms, and hands. My chest, upper back, lower back. I notice my belly, pelvis, legs, and feet. Breathing, noticing, accepting. Breathing, noticing, accepting. I accept myself fully. And now I bring my awareness back to the room. Opening my eyes, I bring my awareness back to the screen, ready to bring acceptance with me. May we all bring a deeper awareness and acceptance with us as we come back to the world of nursing for just a few more moments. One thing that helps me remain a school nurse is remembering those lighter moments and the times when I've truly helped someone with my nursing experience. Keep adding stories of how you have made a difference. Let this be the start of your school nurse gratitude list. Let's end with another quote from a nurse from another area of nursing who says it so well. Doss McQuitty wrote this for nephrology nurses in their journal, and this is the last quote I will be reading. I encourage each of us to be there for our colleagues, remembering that errors can happen at any time by and to each of us. Second victims are no different from any of us. They just made an unintentional and unfortunate error. Instead of blaming, shaming, and abandoning, we need to address the impact on the caregiver who made the error, while remembering that rarely is it due to intentional negligence or malice. Let's be there for our colleagues and for ourselves. Thank you for your attention, and may we all be gentle with ourselves.